Okay. Now, without further delay, I would like to pass the session to our presenter for today, Dr. Alison Borthwick. Over to you, please. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. And a really big thank you to my two co-moderators as well. Lovely to see you. And hello, everybody. And I should start by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are zooming in from. I am currently zooming in from the UK, so for me it's the morning, but I can see already from the chat box, lots of you are already having a lovely afternoon, and some of you have even entered into the evening as well. So I do hope wherever you are keeping safe, but a really big welcome to the session today on effective pedagogy. So what are we going to do today? Well, I can see already that lots of you have been entering your name and where you're based into the chat box, so please continue to do that. It is lovely to see who we have with us today, and it really does help to connect with each other, you know, in this online training situation. It would be helpful if you wanted to put your role, again, that just gives us some more information that we can try and use. And also, what are you looking forward to learning about today? Again, I'll try and keep an eye on the chat box, and I know my two co-hosts, co-moderators are going to do the same as well. And please do use the chat box to talk to each other, to support each other, to ask questions of each other as well. It's not just for me and for my colleagues to have a look at what you're saying. Really do support each other as well. And particularly if I'm talking through some of the slides and you feel that you can contribute, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So I've been really lucky enough to be able to work with Cambridge International since 2011. I've had the privilege of working in over 22 countries, writing training, delivering training, supporting the Cambridge conferences, doing trainer selection events. So I feel that I'm, you know, very privileged position. And again, it's lovely to see such a huge number of you with me today. So we're going to have a presentation. I will talk to you for about 30 minutes and then we will have around about 20 to 25 minutes left to do some questions and answers. So again, as my co-hosts have already indicated, please use either the chat box or the Q&A box to post any questions. They will be monitoring that and they will be picking up particularly pertinent ones, particularly relevant to this webinar in particular. And those are two of the things that we're going to be exploring today in this session. Really thinking about some of those key aspects that we as teachers can consider when we're teaching in this online setting that we find ourselves in. And I don't know about you, but certainly the last 4 months have been very interesting. I now use words like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and online learning as though they're part of my normal vocabulary, but certainly they weren't as much there in my teaching and my learning before COVID-19. So we're really going to think about how can we use what we already know, but really make sure that we're doing a really good job in that online setting, whether we are completely thinking about teaching virtually, face-to-face, or indeed, as many of you are already starting to do, to move towards that blended model. And therefore thinking about the importance of pedagogy in delivering that effective curriculum. So I have a question to ask you. So this is your first task for this webinar today. I think we should really just think about kind of what is pedagogy, because there are a range of meanings attached to this. So I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask you in the chat box to complete that sentence that I've already started. So pedagogy is, or what is pedagogy? So would you like to contribute? Just have a little think about what does it mean to you as a teacher, as a head of department, whatever your role is. What is it there? And I can see already people are putting in the chat box. That's fantastic. So I can see we've got teaching techniques, methods of teaching, the art of teaching. Again, methods is coming up there. Some more teaching techniques. Lovely, brilliant. I've obviously got the elite group with me today. Art and science of teaching. I like that one. Great. And again, I think as my co-hosts mentioned, you will be receiving the chat box as well. So this is really helpful for you and also for me to see what other people really are thinking about those definitions. That is fantastic. Some great things there. I love that. Encouragement for learning. What a lovely phrase. Developing metacognition coming up, facilitating learning, methods and styles. Brilliant. So please keep thinking about that question, because it's one of those things that we are going to be talking about today. But certainly, as I've already mentioned, the range of meanings attached to pedagogy varies so much. But perhaps we could settle on one that talks of pedagogy being both the act of teaching and its contingent theories and debates. Pedagogy is the discourse with which we all need to engage with in order to teach intelligently and make sense of teaching. And I think in a way there can be no teaching without pedagogy, but equally no pedagogy without teaching. So it is a key theme, and yet according to some people like Dr. Robin Alexander, for example, the key thing, the key element that we need to be thinking about in the whole kind of art of education, and yet often it is neglected or ignored. And as we've already seen from the chat box, it is a complex field of practice and theory and research in its own right. And the skill, of course, is to balance your curriculum, your bespoke curriculum, with the study of teaching and learning that respects both of those fields and yet creates something which is greater than the sum of its parts. So I guess for me, trying to take all of what you said in the chat box and all of the literature around pedagogy, I can simplify pedagogy into what teachers and learners do in the classroom. It is the essence of being able to educate. And we really need to think about those connections there, because as I've already said, pedagogy is often the thing that perhaps we don't talk about as much as curriculum or assessment. I'm constantly getting asked questions about, so how do we do assessment? What does assessment look like? Formative, summative, assessment for learning. Yesterday on the webinar that we delivered, again, lots of questions about curriculum, how much of the curriculum should we be covering? What's the best way to cover the curriculum? But I don't often get asked about pedagogy. So, let's talk about the art of pedagogy, the act of teaching, the act of learning. Is it different to face-to-face or different to online? And actually, if you notice that diagram, I'm hoping what you're already noticing is that those three boxes, the curriculum, pedagogy and assessment, they are all connected to each other. So we actually can't deliver a curriculum without thinking about pedagogy and assessment. We can't talk about assessment without considering the pedagogy and the curriculum as well. So I guess a curriculum can only be successful if teachers understand how to adapt their professional practice to teach it effectively. And that's really what we're talking about today. And by identifying what works well, assessment, we can then build on that and using professional judgment really move towards the thing that we're all hoping to do, and the reason we're here is that enabling effective learning. So I think it's just really important to pause and just think about, so how many times, how many conversations, how many training events do we have around pedagogy as opposed to curriculum and assessment? Because those three models are completely intertwined. Okay, so let's have a think about what is the same and what's different between the pedagogy of face-to-face teaching when we're in the classroom, and what's the same and what's different between the pedagogy of online learning and online teaching. And of course, the mixture of those two is the blended model as well. So what I've popped on the screen there are actually some of the key aspects that Cambridge totally believe are important for effective pedagogical teaching. And actually, one of the things that I'm now going to suggest to you is that all of those things that I know you will recognise, and you will say, well, of course, we do learning objectives and we have success criteria and high expectations and so on. And all of those things we would recognise totally as effective pedagogical practices in face-to-face classroom teaching. But is there any difference between what we do in the classroom and what we do online? And actually, I'm going to suggest that there isn't in this respect, in terms of the things that we need to think about. So we still need to have learning objectives and success criteria, perhaps what we sometimes refer to as object-led planning. We still need to have those when we are teaching in an online virtual situation. Of course, we still need to have high expectations. But one of the things I've been talking about over the series of webinars we've been delivering is that we sometimes need to alter expectations. And I'm going to talk to you about how to alter expectations for pedagogical techniques in the next few slides. But high expectations remain key. Giving time limits, we know that actually we do need to set times, whether it's you have 5 minutes to do a task or 10 days to complete a project. But time limits are something that we do have within our pedagogical toolkit. High quality feedback linked also to assessment for learning. We know that actually, again, thinking about that diagram, that assessment and pedagogy are intrinsically linked. So we need to ensure that when we are teaching online, that high quality feedback and that assessment for learning is there. It's going to look a little bit different, but it still needs to be part of our pedagogical toolkit. Active learning I've popped on there because, again, active learning, metacognition, these are key elements that are at the heart of the Cambridge pedagogical approach. Now, we know what active learning looks like in the classroom, but what are we doing in terms of facilitating active learning in an online setting? Because if that's one of our key elements that makes up effective pedagogy, then we may need to alter how we achieve active learning in an online setting, but it's really key that it's still there. And then, of course, I wanted to just include that language use and that quality learner talk, which we know is absolutely key. So again, acquiring the language is a skill in itself, particularly as lots of our learners are learning the Cambridge curriculum through second, third, fourth language mediums. But that quality learner talk is so important because the art of being able to critique and reason and explain and convince across all of those subjects is absolutely paramount if we are wanting to encourage our learners to be confident and resilient and innovative and responsive. So those aspects that we would recognise as key pedagogical traits in the face-to-face classroom are still there in the virtual classroom. So let's now have a little think about how can we take all of those aspects and really think about online teaching. And so for the next 5 slides, I've just got some tips, if you like, to share with you about things to think about that we can then hopefully achieve these elements through. Okay, so tip number 1. I think this is really important to remember that face-to-face, online, blended model, you are still the role model. And therefore you need to model the behaviour you would like to see from your learners. So that can mean lots and lots of different things. For example, you'll notice today that even though it's really hot in the UK, which is still a surprise to me, you know, I've dressed up, I've got my jacket on, because I'm actually in an educational setting. Just because I'm training from my study in my house doesn't mean that I'm going to alter what I wear, for example. Hopefully being able to encourage you to say hello in the chat, to just, you know, give a little bit of feedback. I'm trying to initiate that active learning there. So what I'm trying to do the whole time, whether I'm training adults, talking to adults, training and educating learners, so I'm trying to constantly model the behaviour that I want. So I really think about all of those different elements that I would be doing in the classroom and then thinking, so how can I transfer and be a really good role model in that online setting? So giving those enthusiastic messages, you know, it's lovely to see you all. Thank you very much for those contributions, trying to pick up those little bits. And again, somebody's just put in the chat, happy teacher leads to happy learning. I love that. It's absolutely true. So again, being enthusiastic, praising learners for being online, because we know it's difficult for many of them getting online either through a synchronous time slot or asynchronous. It's going to be challenging for lots of different reasons. So we perhaps need to give enthusiastic messages and praise for perhaps different elements than we would necessarily in the classroom. But again, that message is there about being enthusiastic. Trying to offer those quick responses. You know, I'm going to come up and say a little bit later on that your learners are missing you. They're missing each other and they're missing you. So the quicker we can kind of give those quick responses to ensure that that connection is there is really important. And of course, if we're trying to be quick and responsive, then it's modelling the behaviour that we want from them as well. And I mean in lots of different situations, whether it's quick in terms of literally, you know, online doing a synchronous session, or whether they've sent you something. And again, I'm not necessarily meaning lots of marking here, just acknowledging that they've sent you things, you know, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to reading that, or I can see that you've worked hard on something. That's great. Thank you very much. So again, modeling that role behavior. And of course, all of that ties into being positive. I think over the last 4 months, what I've really reflected on is really thinking about this situation that we find ourselves in as a really positive one. I don't think I would have been able to have delivered as many webinars as I have. And to begin with, that was really scary. But actually it's given me a new set of skills. So that's a positive element that's come out of this pandemic. So just really trying to be positive about the situation we find ourselves in will really help your learners as well. So that first tip is wrapped up in that role model, that positive growth mindset. The second tip is about creating that community, because we might really value things like the high expectations and the learning objectives and the time limits, all of those aspects of pedagogy we saw a few minutes ago. But if we haven't managed to create and continue that community that we have in the classroom, we're going to find it a little bit harder. So it might be that before you start any of your sessions, you use icebreakers. And those icebreakers can be anything from, what's your favourite word today? Which number did you use regularly yesterday? Give me one word that actually, you know, explains how you're feeling today. And again, that icebreaker gives you that opportunity to be positive, to be really responsive. And again, it's that active learning. It might look a little bit different to what we were doing in the classroom. That's about altering expectations, but again, it's creating that sense of community. It might be that you want to share some personal information. Your learners are probably desperate to see, you know, where you live, what you do when you're not in school. I know certainly the ones I work with, you know, really want to know things. So be a little bit selective about what you share, obviously. But again, it's a way of creating that information and that sense of community. So I've shared with you today that I'm sitting in my study, that I'm zooming in from the UK, and that actually it's quite hot here today. I know probably those of you in India and Indonesia will be saying, it's really not hot compared to where you are, but for me, it's quite warm today, which is lovely. So again, just giving little bits of personal information away helps to create that bond. And also having those academic and social sessions is really important. And it's something that I've been talking about continually through lockdown and circuit breaker. The fact that, you know, in the classroom, we feel very pressured for time, so we don't necessarily have to or need to create the social situations. But you are now separated from your learners. And so I think it's really important that in order to ensure that we can talk about learning objectives and success criteria, we also have a moment to, as people are saying in the chat box, create those bonds. So it might be that you have a social session perhaps, you know, it is only the social session that you're talking about for that particular day. It might be that you just start off an icebreaker in a social way, but again, it just gives those learners that opportunity to have that community. And one of the things that I know that some schools are doing is having what they're calling a learners virtual cafe. And I love that idea. Actually, can we all be online at 10 o'clock and make sure you've got a drink and a biscuit or a piece of fruit, and we're just going to talk about what we've been doing this morning. And then perhaps we'll talk about the learning objectives for the science session that's coming up, or we'll critique a piece of work, or we'll talk about a book that we've been reading. But just take a little bit more time to create that community. Even though I know that you will be thinking about getting through the curriculum, if we don't create that community and allow our learners to have that social engagement, we're going to find it even more harder to get through the curriculum. Tip number 3, again, that safe online environment. So as we would with the classroom situation, we would have rules. We would perhaps, you know, look to our learners to create them and say, so what are going to be our expectations? Is it okay that if somebody's talking, somebody else is talking? Is it okay that if we're doing an activity, you get up and go and do something else? So in the classroom, I'm guessing that, you know, for lots of you, that answer would be no, that's not what we expect. So I guess my question to you is, have you created the time to sit down with your learners virtually and create and share those online classroom rules? Because actually, it's really, really important. If your learners are online, you want them there totally dedicated to you, to their peer group, to what it is you're doing. And I've heard that people have been saying that, you know, learners lose interest, that sometimes they're doing other things while they're online. And actually, I think, you know, one of the things that I would encourage you to be doing is to say, we're going to be online for a shorter amount of time. However, these are our online rules. And again, thinking about, you know, if we want to get to the art of teaching and the success criteria and the quality feedback, then we need to make sure that a safe online environment is created to begin with. Valuing all contributions, I'm absolutely certain you do all of that. But again, it's just noting who have you got either in a synchronous session, or who's contributing, sending work through. And of course, not all contributions have to be verbal. One of the things that I've noticed is that both learners and adults change their persona depending on whether they're face-to-face or online. So it might be that some of your more chatty learners in the classroom actually become reluctant talkers when they're in the online situation. So again, thinking about the different ways that they can value and you can value their contributions is important. And therefore that will lead you to thinking about making sure that all learners participate. Again, participation doesn't have to be through verbal communication. It could be something that they've offered, an idea that they've suggested, but just making sure that, you know, even participation by active listening is really important. And I did that a couple of weeks ago when I was with a group of learners, and I'd noticed that some of them weren't necessarily talking. So at one point I said, "Oh, Hannah, I can see that you've been really listening really well." Now, I don't know whether Hannah had been listening really well, but it certainly made her listen there on in, and it also made the others sit up and pay attention. So again, it's creating that safe online environment, but under those rules. Tip number 4, again, thinking about the pedagogy, thinking about how we want to maintain those high expectations, but also thinking about the curriculum and assessment. Perhaps what we need to be doing when we're looking at the curriculum is finding out what learners enjoy, and both with a personal and with a school context. But certainly, you know, being able to say to them, you know, over the last week of learning, what was the activity or what was the task that I asked you to do that you enjoyed the most? And why did you enjoy it? Was it just because it was a subject that you like, or was it the way that you'd altered your pedagogy? So for example, I think that we are using a lot more of technology at the moment. Again, that's great. Perhaps we wouldn't necessarily be using the extent of the technology if we were in the classroom. So let's make the most of that. So, you know, it might be that, for example, rather than writing a story, your learners are putting together a storyboard through digital images or photographs or drawings. So again, just thinking, well, what was it that you enjoyed? What was your most favourite day, session, activity, task? It could be the one where actually you held a social session, because actually they have been missing their peers, they've been missing their teachers, and actually they just enjoyed coming online and talking to each other. That in itself is a skill. And one of the things that I'm always saying is that your learners are continually learning. They haven't stopped learning, it just looks a little bit different. I've just noticed that somebody's put in the chat box that they do a 1-minute dance for celebrating success. I love that idea. That is fantastic. Brilliant. So thinking about surveying your learners' interests, really important. Finding out what it is that their future goals and aspirations are. Again, these are the things that, I don't know, perhaps we wouldn't necessarily do these in the face-to-face classroom, but we can do this in the online classroom. And then thinking about that online learning, that online curriculum will really help. So saying to them, you know, out of the various apps or websites that we've engaged with, which was your favourite and why? The last tip that we're going to talk about is really trying to build in learners to share their knowledge and experiences. And again, this could take lots of different formats. So it's about utilising examples that learners might be able to offer. So if we find out more about our learners, we might be able to find out opportunities, use opportunities that, for example, they can share. So we could say, oh, Hannah, you know, you said yesterday that you went to the park for half an hour. Can you talk to us about what did you see? How was it? Just, you know, being able to kind of share their experiences. What did you notice? Did you do some sorting and classifying while you were there? Those types of things. Celebrating, critiquing, editing learners' work. Again, that's a way for them to share their knowledge and experiences, but again is making them accountable, which is that third bullet point. So it's about being able to say, in the classroom, we would be doing probably much more collaboration, group work, pair work than perhaps we're being able to do it online at the moment. So let's think about ways of carrying on those pedagogical techniques, but in a different way. So for example, editing online is actually probably much easier than editing on paper. I know certainly when I ask learners to edit mathematical problems or look at their writing and critique it, those types of things, you know, in the classroom with a paper-based work, they're a little bit less, you know, they're a little bit more reluctant to do it. Online, because it's so easy to edit and critique, because we've typed something, the computer is helping us often with spell checking and grammar. Well, that's great, let's use that. So again, we are able to say to them, actually, Hannah was able to critique somebody else's work really, really well the other day. Hannah, would you like to talk to us about that? I also use Hannah, by the way, because that's my daughter's name. So I just, you know, I naturally fall into using it. And again, I think that last bullet point is really important, making learners realise that just because they're not with you in the classroom every day, they are still accountable for their learning. And I think particularly when we start to move towards a more blended model of learning, this is going to be even more important. So the fact that, you know, we think about, well, if I've asked you to do this at home, in an online situation, but I potentially might be seeing you in the classroom tomorrow or next week, actually this piece of work that I've asked you to do is going to connect to the piece of work that we've done in the classroom. Now, hopefully you're going to make sure that if this piece of work isn't done for whatever reason, this piece of work can carry on. However, if we can start to show learners that it doesn't matter where they're learning, that learning is connected, it's continuous, then actually it's making them a little bit more accountable as well. So really thinking about those tips that we've been talking about are ways of thinking about altering our pedagogy for online teaching, but maintaining all of those qualities and elements of pedagogical teaching that we would know are really effective, particularly when we're talking about implementing Cambridge pedagogy, Cambridge curriculum, Cambridge assessments. So really thinking about, have I made sure that each time we have a session, I've set learning objectives, whether it's a social session or an academic session. What are the objectives for this session? What's the success criteria? Have I thought about giving that quality feedback to the students in terms of assessment for learning? Have I thought about how I'm going to facilitate the language use and the learner talk? All of those things that we would be doing, just thinking ever so slightly differently about that online situation. So let's just think about, we are nearly at the end of the session, but let's just think about that online learning, that online teaching versus that face-to-face learning, that face-to-face teaching. So again, really thinking about kind of what might we just need to alter in terms of our expectations, but not lower expectations. So it might be that when we're online, we need to have shorter sessions. Lots of people are starting to say to me that learners are struggling to be present at all of the online sessions, or their interest is waning. So actually, let's have more sessions, but for a shorter amount of time. Now that's something that looks different in the classroom. We tend to have longer sessions, and certainly that second bullet point, the learning is scheduled, it's timetabled. We know exactly when we're doing maths or geography or art and design, but we can be more flexible online. So let's have shorter sessions online and also more breaks. And I think it's really important to schedule those breaks in as well for your learners. Otherwise, they might be feeling that they do have to be online from 8 o'clock till 2 o'clock, for example. Actually, we know in the online setting, that's not what is particularly helpful. It's not about replicating what they do at school to at home. Another thing that you might want to think about is that in the classroom, you would usually be giving your learners one task, obviously differentiated, but one task to do. But it might be that you want to think about giving a choice of tasks instead in that online situation, particularly if you're thinking about the resources that learners may or may not have, or the opportunities. Again, connecting to that, perhaps shorter tasks versus longer projects. It's quite easy to do longer projects in the classroom because you've got them there, whether you're seeing them every day, every week, every fortnight, you have that regularity. So it might be that we're thinking about those shorter tasks at the moment. Individual versus group work. Well, hopefully we are still able to do both, whether it's an online or a face-to-face situation, but certainly at the moment, we're probably doing a little bit more individual online work. So again, it's just thinking, so how can I connect my learners in a group situation? The really interesting question that again, people have said to me, and I totally understand, is, getting through the curriculum, but actually that new knowledge is actually, think about the retrieval of existing knowledge compared to new knowledge. Now, if you know that you're moving towards a blended model of learning, so you know that, for example, you're going to have your learners in, I don't know, in 2 weeks' time or in a month or whatever, then it might be that you hold and alter your scheme of work so that you're teaching the new knowledge when you're in the classroom, and you're using more opportunities to do that retrieval of knowledge, that retrieval practice when you're online. And finally, thinking about that online persona versus that face-to-face persona. Just have a little think about, how do you come across online? Do you think you're the same? Have you changed? Have you still maintained your online persona, which is the same as your face-to-face? So again, just some things to think about as we move towards both thinking about online, face-to-face and blended. I think we've perhaps covered this really, but just, just a little think about that social and emotional learning. Because when we're thinking about effective pedagogy, we're thinking about all aspects of the art, the act of teaching. And that includes social and emotional, as well as academic learning. So as I've already said, learners are missing their teachers. And it is difficult to replicate that in-person experience. So there's just a few things that we've probably already covered today. Thinking about, perhaps doing a personal video message. It can be 30 seconds long, a minute long, but just to be able to say, hi everybody, hope you're doing really well. Gosh, wasn't that thunderstorm we had yesterday? That was really loud. Did you get wet? What have you been up to? Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at our next synchronous session. That's all it needs to take, and suddenly your learners will think that you've really remembered about them. It might be that you have the opportunity to do emails or phone calls. Your schools, I know, will have been advising you on this. And certainly, as we've already talked about, having those non-academic group or class sessions. Again, just thinking about the other aspects of learning, that actually if we don't think about the social and emotional learning, then the academic learning is going to be a little bit more tricky. So I guess my penultimate slide is just to remind you that, we are reflective practitioners. And I think teachers are, really up there in terms of the professions that we have available. We are very, very good at being reflective. And certainly we're very good at reviewing our lessons, reviewing our planning, and really asking ourselves, did that lesson work? What could I have done better? If I was to teach that lesson again, what would I do differently? Now, just because we do that in the face-to-face arena, we absolutely need to do that in the online arena as well. So I've just put some questions on the slide for you to think about. So what can you do to make your online lessons more interactive? What about making them more enjoyable and memorable? I think the more that we find ourselves in this situation, the more we need to think creatively, innovatively, and I know that as people are saying, we need to follow the course book, and absolutely you do, but it might be that following the course book in terms of the learning objectives is there, but certainly you won't be able to follow all of the activities that are necessarily in the course book, because of course it's designed to be a face-to-face course book and curriculum. Thinking about improving those interactions with all of our learners, and just having those reflections, every now and then thinking, well, is there anything lacking in my online classroom? So again, just thinking about that reflection, because we reflect on the curriculum, we reflect on the assessment, so let's make sure that we reflect on the pedagogy as well. So I really wanted to finish by just putting that really, really powerful slide back up again, just to remind you that, we do talk about the curriculum a lot. We do talk about assessment a lot, but we really need to make sure that the pedagogy is there, that actually we don't neglect the pedagogy. It doesn't begin and end in the classroom. It goes backwards and forwards between the curriculum and the assessment. And it is what strengthens both of those things. So I hope that's been really useful. Thank you very much. There's been some fantastic comments coming up in the chat box, but I'm going to hand back over to my two amazing co-hosts, moderators, and we'll take some questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Alison, for the great presentation. Now we will move on to the Q&A. As informed, please do add your question to the Q&A box, and we will now start to look at your questions. Okay, for the first questions is from Helen Phillips, Dr. Alisa. She wants to know the tips for demonstrating art technique to your grade 9 student when they are in a classroom 3,500 miles away. And there is a big time difference, and you are the teacher, you are working throughout the night to teach them online.
Well, I like the fact that she's actually put on the question, anyone please, because, I don't want to, I'm flattered that you might think I can answer that question. I mean, I think, again, it's actually people are putting some lovely things into the chat box I can see. I think it's about thinking, what do you do in the classroom, and therefore what's transferable into an online situation? And I know that doesn't necessarily answer the question, but, if you are, I'm sure you're very, very effective, Helen, at teaching art techniques. So what are those art techniques that you teach in the classroom? What can you replicate online? And really thinking about, you know, using some of the apps and the websites that we have available. But I that's particularly a hard one to answer. But hopefully somebody in the participants has got a better answer there as well. But I think it's about, you know, making sure that those pedagogy, those aspects of pedagogy that I've been talking about are still there. So we still have those learning objectives, we still have the success criteria, and you know, use the space around you. So if you would be, you know, talking about the art, for example, it might be that you need to potentially hold off some of the practical side of the teaching of art until you have your students back in the classroom, but, you know, maybe look at moving your scheme of work around so that you can do some of the objectives that you could do in an online situation, and holding some of the practical side of art for when you have them back in face-to-face situations.
Thank you very much, Alison. We have our next question from Rema Nar, who would like to know, how do we conduct tests or examinations in an online setting?
I don't think you can. I think is the very, very quick answer. And certainly I've been listening to our Cambridge assessment experts over the last 4 months. And I know that certainly one of the things that they are encouraging, if possible, is that, you know, things like progression tests and checkpoint, you know, what they're saying is that, first of all, ask yourself why you need to do assessment. What is the purpose and the point of the assessment? Because assessment is such a big word, and actually, you know, that I think that question, you know, is more about summative assessment. But actually remember that you know, Cambridge is very, very keen for us to be engaging in formative assessment and assessment for learning. So if you think about assessment as feedback, you know, we have assessment really for 2 reasons.
Thank you, Dr. Alison.
Yeah, do you want me to? Yeah. So one is about knowing where our students are. Now, we can do that formatively. We don't need to give them a test or an examination to find out where they are. We have other mechanisms to do that. And the other is, as a teacher, to know what to do next. So I think in terms of conducting a test or an examination, if you're going to do that, you need to really make sure that, is it a fair playing field for your students? Are they all going to be able to, first of all, find the time, find the concentration to do a test? Is the test going to be influenced by anybody around them? And if you're in doubt at any of those things, then possibly it's not a fair thing to ask your students to do. Perhaps try and wait until you have your students back in school to do a test, and do things as people are suggesting, you know, that you can do some quizzes online, you can do some project-based assessments, but I would certainly encourage everybody to be thinking about self-assessment for students as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Alison. So we have another question from Joel Francis. Content, pedagogy, and assessment are the basic of teaching in a face-to-face setting. Does this still remain the same in the online setting, or should there be a modification to that?
No. Absolutely. No, content, pedagogy and assessment. And content, for me, I would say content is curriculum. So curriculum, pedagogy and assessment are absolutely the basis of teaching. And if we don't have, if one of those, for example, you know, isn't as equal as the other two, then it's going to lead to ineffective learning. So you really can't separate, you know, if you've got a curriculum, then how you deliver that curriculum, in other words, pedagogy, is really important. The choices that you make in terms of how you deliver the curriculum, how you assess the curriculum are still there. What you might need to do is change and alter your pedagogy. So, you know, things about, look at those tips that we've been talking about today. There are certain things that we might need to do that we don't need to necessarily do in the classroom, because we have other cues like body language and more time with our students, but certainly we still need to have those 3 elements there. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alison. We do have one question for Sheetal Bhagat, who is asking about how can we make checking and correcting of students' work more effective, whether there are any tools or ideas that can be shared.
Well, I think the quick answer is we're doing a webinar next week on formative assessment. so I'm going to be able to give you a very, very quick answer today. But if you want some more time, then we're actually running another webinar next week on formative assessment. I think there is a couple of things. First of all, I've already mentioned self-assessment. This is a really good opportunity to enable and to train all of our learners, whatever age they are, to be much better at reflecting on their own work. So as teachers, we are still modelling and we're still scaffolding, and we can still be asking those questions, you know, what do you think, you know, how do you think you've done? What do you think you could do better? What are you particularly proud of? We can be asking those, but actually getting our students, our learners, to be much more accountable and getting them to reflect on their learning is, you know, this is a great opportunity that we've been given. So first of all, I would think about self-assessment. Once your students are equipped and competent at self-assessment, certainly the next step would be peer assessment. But I think also that checking and that marking, it might be, I was talking yesterday in the webinar, that you might set a task to do for your learners. And you might say to them, you know, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 days to complete this task. And then what I'm going to do as your teacher is put up a model answer, for example. Now, over time, that model answer can maybe less modelled. So actually we can start to create some misconceptions there to cause cognitive conflict. But certainly saying, so if you've had a go at the task, now have a look at what I'm putting up and, you know, what's the same and what's different. So again, we're encouraging that self-assessment. We're encouraging our learners to actually mark themselves, to actually have a look. And of course, as the teacher, you might want to still take in certain pieces of work to mark, but I would certainly be encouraging, whether you're in an online situation or a face-to-face situation, much more self-assessment, much more peer assessment. Because actually, the thing about learning is that it doesn't have to be right. And I think at the moment we're so worried about getting the right answer. Well, actually, it doesn't matter. Learning is actually, you know, a whole raft of making mistakes, making, you know, misconceptions, being able to think and reason. So I think, again, this situation that we find ourselves in with COVID, we can really take this opportunity and say, you've done a great piece of work. Well, what do you think about it? And I'm not necessarily going to tell you whether it's right or wrong. You're going to tell me whether it's right or wrong. It's hard for learners, though. It's a tough one.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Alison. So a question from Sundra Kamashi. How do we motivate children during online classes, and any?
Can you repeat the question? The Wi-Fi just buffered a little bit.
Okay, sorry. No. How do we motivate children during online classes, and any strategy if you could suggest?
Again, this is another webinar next week. So again, I can give you a short answer. I think, yeah, we're running another webinar next week called the Fun Virtual Classroom. I think first of all, keep it short. You know, I've said, you know, quite often, keep tasks shorter, much shorter than they would be in the classroom, because then we are able to maintain and hold learners' interests a little bit longer. The second thing is, again, think about your pedagogy. Think about, well, you know, if you started with a question for one session, maybe start by asking your learners to submit questions, asking them what they're interested in. You know, again, if you find out what they're really interested in, then you can start to tailor your teaching and your learning so that it's really including their current needs, their current situations. Again, that's something that we probably wouldn't be doing in the classroom. And I know that I can already hear people saying, but we need to follow the course textbooks. And again, it's a yes and a no. You know, the course textbooks is giving you a framework, but we can't necessarily follow everything that's in the course textbook because it's not written for online learning. So just be a little bit, I guess, more flexible, be creative, be innovative. But again, you know, I think one of the biggest things that I always say, so if you were learning, what would make it fun for you? and then translate that into your learners as well. But certainly shorter tasks, just a little bit different each time, and making sure that they are fully involved are my 3 top tips.
Thank you, Alison. That's really insightful. Our next question has to do with personal information. What is acceptable and unacceptable to students when teachers ask them this during the sessions?
With regards to what?
It doesn't really say, but
personal information.
Yeah, so personal information during the session, yeah.
I think that's really up to the teacher and up to the school. I mean, there's certainly things that I wouldn't share, and obviously I'm not going to tell you what they are. I think kind of just decide as a teacher, kind of just the things that you think your students would be interested in. So, for example, you know, from my context, whenever I go into school, you know, the learners, first of all, they always want to know where I've been. You know, where were you this morning, or where did you go yesterday, or you know, do you have any pets, or you know, do you have any children? Just, I think, just some information that you want to give. And I think, you know, somebody's, you know, really helpfully put, you know, certainly culturally influenced as well. You know, be sensitive about what you give. But, you know, you can say things like, oh, now, do you like the jacket I'm wearing today? Because I think this is my favourite jacket. Can anybody tell me why this is my favourite jacket? Because actually, red is one of my favourite colours. Now, it doesn't matter whether it is or it isn't. You're giving some personal information, and the learners think, oh, our teacher likes red. They might then, you know, write their next piece of writing using red font. Well, that's keeping them interested. They feel that they've got a bond, they're connecting with you. So again, I think you can be quite clever about the information that you give. Certainly don't give lots away, but just give enough for them to think that you're connected with them.
Thank you, Alison. Okay, I think this is a question more participant also, I believe, asking the question. This is from Sushela. Can you give us more example of icebreakers?
Well, actually, I would like to appeal to the audience. Perhaps the participants, you know, have got some really good icebreakers that they could put into the chat box there, maybe. But certainly some of the icebreakers that I use, sometimes I ask learners to bring an object to the session. Just bring an object that means something, personal information or context, and it can be academic related or non-academic related. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing that I sometimes use as an icebreaker is, I think I've already said in the session today, you know, tell me what your favorite colour is, or tell me what, you know, which number what's your favorite number today and why. Those types of things. Oh, people are putting in the chat box lots of lovely things there, brilliant. So some riddles, 2 truths and a lie, play a musical instrument that they're learning. Gosh, we've got some very high performing teachers here. But certainly, you know, things like, say something nice about your friend. Oh, that's lovely. Some really, really nice ones there. So I knew that this was a great group today. So I think actually the participants are doing a great job of answering that question.
Thank you, Alison. For the next question, it has to do with science subjects. How can we conduct and share experiment-based learning in an online setting for these subjects?
In terms of science, is that?
Science, yes, science-based subjects.
So again, one of the things that I would say to begin with is I would look at your science scheme of work, and I'd think about, so what experiments could you absolutely not do at home, and therefore I would move those out of the scheme of work and shift, you know, to perhaps the latter part of the scheme of work. So if, for example, you were going to do something in the next, the scheme of work said to do something in the next month, and you think, well, actually I can't, you know, we're not in school, I would move that to a different part of the scheme of work where I was hoping that I would have the learners back in the classroom. So I think that's the first thing to say. Move your scheme of work around so that it works for you, whether you're online or face-to-face. The second thing is to look at what the science objectives are actually asking you to do. So, for example, it might be about, I don't know, it might be doing some sorting and classifying, or looking at materials, for example, that are waterproof. Now, it might be that the experiment that you would have done in the classroom would have some different resources, but you could certainly ask learners to explore something like, you know, investigating waterproof materials at home. What I would say is that you need to really carefully model, structure, scaffold those types of things, so that learners and anybody that's helping them, any parents, know exactly what they're looking for. So rather than saying, actually, you know, can you investigate which materials are waterproof, you might say, what types of materials could we be thinking about? So we could be thinking about wood, we could be thinking about fabric, we could be thinking about metal. So what types of objects do we have at home that are metal, that are wood, that are fabric, and so on? So actually the teaching part is enabling the students to think about investigating materials, and then they can go and do that at home. You can talk about fair testing, you can talk about the 5 cycles of conducting an experiment. But I think, you know, there are certain things that we can do at home. They might look a little bit different, but we can do them. But there are other things, perhaps, you know, some, particularly some of the more chemical-based science experiments, that you absolutely don't want students to be doing at home, and therefore move them in your scheme of work to hopefully a time and a place when you've got your students back in school with you. I think we have to accept that the current situation needs us to alter our expectations. We can't just carry on and you know, do everything that we would have been doing in school at home. You know, that is not the reality of the situation, but we can do lots of things at home.
Interesting. Thank you, Dr. Alison. I believe that's the last question due to time. Just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Alison Borthwick, for your sharing with us your experience and ideas in today's webinar. I hope everyone has found today's session very helpful. I know I did. It's very interesting for me to learn. Just one last point before we leave. A web browser with the feedback form will pop up in your screen as you leave the session. It would be great if you can take about 2 minutes to complete the feedback form, and it will be most certainly help us to improve on our future webinar. And thank you once again for Dr. Alison Borthwick for delivering the today's session. And thank you to all of the attendees for taking time to join us today. I would like to say thank you also to Suli and also to Saliza for becoming our co-moderator for today's session. I wish you all a lovely evening, afternoon, and probably morning. Take care of you. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.